Good Monday morning, concepts of lit scholars. So I hope you all had a nice weekend and looking forward to another week of exciting poetry here online with me. Anyway, um, what I want to do before we start our next unit within our larger unit of poetry is to talk a little bit about the two poems that we studied quite extensively last week, and Jennifer's um, Tigers and My Papa's Waltz. And I want to first say that you guys did an awesome job with these responses and analysis of both Anne Jennifer's Tigers and My Papa's Waltz. I also enjoyed reading your discussions after watching the video of My Papa's Waltz and realizing that there are multiple ways to look at the meaning and tone of a poem, which is awesome. So let's start with Anne Jennifer's Tigers. So with this poem, we had you were asked to paraphrase 3 stanzas of the poem and then to create a summary. These are some of your responses. And these are excellent. There were many excellent responses, but I wanted to share some of these with you. So if you recall the first stanza, this is where they're talking about her embroidering these tigers, and they are moving majestically across the canvas, across the tapestry that they are creating, and it specifically mentions that they aren't afraid, that they are confident. And these are apparently, as it says down here, Aunt Jennifer wants to be like the tigers. Remember, when you paraphrase, you're saying what's only being implied by the words on the page. And that's exactly what's being implied, that Aunt Jennifer desires to be free and confident like these tigers. In the second stanza, we learn that she's having some issues and it's difficult for her to sew, and she's being weighed down by this ring. And that doesn't literally mean that the ring is heavy on her finger, but more so that the burden of the ring and the burden of her marriage is what's weighing her down. So look at some of these responses. Aunt Jennifer feels suppressed by her husband. She quivers at the touch of him as she tries to make a representation of how she wants to be, but the heavy marital weight and constraint is holding her back. Wow. So this is interesting because this one, some people viewed the husband as being gone, but his hold on her still being very much there. This one takes the idea that he is actually there, kind of like looking over her and her work. And again, we see the tigers expressing her feelings and how she wants to feel, um, and kind of pushing through that suppression. The second example here, Jennifer's fingers are fluttering, suggesting nervousness and anxiety. As it begins to talk about her husband, it seems as if the nervousness is towards him. It talks about the heaviness of the ring, which to me indicated that the marriage they may have some pressure and stress in it, and that is what is weighing her down. Absolutely. So these are some great responses. And without even realizing it here, because we hadn't talked about tone at this point, but you're really hinting on how these words express that tone, the way that the speaker in the poem seems to feel about the situation here. And then the third stanza, this is when she talks about when she dies, she still will be ringed by these ordeals, and she will still be known as the wife of her husband and all of these things. But the tigers that she created continue to live freely, and essentially that the art will live on. So the message that she left behind will live on even after she is gone. And so hopefully that was quite interesting to you, being that you are all artistic in some way, and essentially seeing that what you leave behind, the art that you create, will leave a mark long after we're gone from this place. And a couple of the summaries. So as you can see, here we're looking at just one stanza and we're seeing how much is being written. And when we come down here to the summaries, we see that we are kind of paring that down and really getting on the main idea. And Jennifer embroiders tapestries with beautiful free tigers who are unafraid. She does this as a coping mechanism, for her husband has control over her, and she knows she can't be free. She knows that even when she is dead, her wedding ring will still remain with her forever. But the tigers she makes will live on forever, beautiful and happy. Perfect, right? So, not that not that this is appropriate, but if you've watched Tiger King at all, like the rest of the world, we could think about all these cool cat and kittens here, and essentially, if Aunt Jennifer had her own tiger, she might feed her husband to them, just like Carol Baskin. Anyway, the second summary we see here, even shorter. Aunt Jennifer is a face of suppression in everyday life as she dreams to be free like the proud and unafraid tiger she embroiders, but is suppressed and terrified by her husband. Boom. Okay, so like I said, you guys knocked this out of the park. Well done. Secondly, then, we're going to take a look at My Papa's Waltz. Again, I have some of your responses of you and your peers up here. So we were looking at 3 different stanzas once again, and then, well, there's actually 4, and then I asked you about the overall and the ending. And again, you guys really knocked it out of the park with these responses. So in My Papa's Waltz, and the reason why I love using this poem for tone is because the way you start reading it is essentially the way that it ends up being. So if you start by honing in on words like whiskey and uneasy and beat and the mother being upset and things like that, then that's how you read the tone of the poem. I was so excited to see that so many of you were kind of picking up on that idea, like these might not be the best memories, but they're all the memories that he has, and he does look fondly back on them. And then when I showed you the video of the young man, yeah, right, of the older gentleman who looked a little bit like a skinny Santa Claus, talking about the way that he felt about the poem, there's a couple things that are interesting in that. One is the way that it made him think of his own um, interactions with his father, and it was a fond memory. And I think that's important too. What we bring to the table, our own backgrounds, really impacts the way that we view and respond to and essentially read and analyze a poem or any work of literature. And we saw that with him and his thoughts about his past and his childhood. And also, he talked about being in a classroom, in a college classroom, and everyone disagreeing with him, including the professor. And I found that quite interesting because that should not be the case, especially with poetry. Poetry is such a subjective art, and it's such an emotional art that unless someone is completely off topic and just trying to do something to be different, rather than focusing on what they're really feeling and getting from something, that professor is doing a disservice by assuming that the way that they're reading it is the only way that it can be read. Anyway, here are some things that were said about the first stanza and the tone. The author is describing what it was like to deal with an alcoholic father. The initial tone of the poem is gloomy. My initial thoughts were that the narrator clung into the father no matter what, even when he was drunk or not acting right. The initial tone seems gloomy, yet innocent and loving. So here we see some of that coming up, some of that paradox in the tone. It is obvious that the speaker is torn with a father who is not stable. I would describe the tone as hopeful. Okay, so even though this might not be a great situation. He loves his father. The boy's father is a heavy drinker, and that is upsetting to him. The boy finds it difficult to deal with his father's actions, an upset and nervous tone. Then we move on to stanza 2, where it talks more about the waltzing. So there's a chaotic mess when it talks about the pots and pans falling off the shelves, and mother's unhappy that they are making a mess. The poem seems as if these actions are playful and with good intentions. Even though the mother seems to be upset and worried, the tone is still innocent from the narrator's point of view, but it is also ominous. So that's interesting. So again, looking back on this fondly, but something isn't quite right. The boy and the father are clumsily romping around the kitchen. They make a mess by knocking down pans, and this does not make mother happy, but the tone in this stanza represents the mother being unsatisfied or somewhat irritated, although that could be playful now, and the boys are just romping around. They're fighting, the pans are falling down from all the ruckus, mom's frowning, feeling like the tone has gotten more intense, almost like the violence is getting stronger. We move on to stanza 3. Here, one response, the tone has changed because it becomes more serious and shows that violence might be a part of the relationship with the father. The buckle probably means a belt, which might be used for harm. So this is where he talks about beating time on his head, and with every misstep, my right ear scrapes a buckle. The son and father are still doing their waltz, but the father is messing up the dance and scraping the son's ear as he misses. What I visualize with this personally, if you've ever, when you were a young child, stood on someone's feet and they danced and you held on to them and all that, you're very close to them, and so it would be easy to imagine that his ear would be close to his father's waist. It talks about his hands being caked hard by dirt. Again, you can look at this in more negative sense, in that he is strong and overpowering the young boy, or that he's a hard worker. Much like the skinny Santa Claus mentioned that, dad would come home after working, have a drink, not drinking to be drunk and unruly, but essentially having that whiskey or whatever. And so again, it depends on a little bit of that background, previous knowledge, and the way that you are reacting to the tone that's being created here. The tone becomes more serious and hardcore because of the words like battered, knuckle, and buckle, and all of that. And then I asked you to think about the ending and the overall tone. Here we have the overall tone of the poem is loving and youthful, all while being dark and hopeless. The poem shows no matter how violent and depressing the times get, the child looks up to the father in an innocent, loving way. This makes me think of that reverse psychology idea. The more someone pushes you away for some reason, the more we want to be close to that person. And so that might be happening here. The overall tone of the poem feels nostalgic. I like that word. The use of that word is great. Overall tone is being unstable or nerve-wracking. From my point of view, I feel a sense of empathy for the boys. I can realize there was a lack of parenting and possibly alcohol abuse going on in the home. A memory of the boys. Situations like these have a strong effect on human memory. Well done. The overall tone of the poem is hurtful. Looking at the father as an alcoholic and being beat. So again, looking at that more negative side of things. You did an awesome job. Like I said, not only did you do well with this, but then after you watched the video and then responded to what you thought and how that person's point of view was different from yours and the way that they looked at the tone and the meaning of the poem, your responses were great. And I appreciate that the majority of you were discussing the fact that there can absolutely be more than two poems, and that's probably, or two meanings to the poem, more than one meaning, I should say, and that's probably the point. And you indeed are correct. So well done with all of that. So today we are going to move in to looking more specifically at the words that come together to create these tones. And so I'm going to end this video here, and I'm going to ask you to take a look at the video and slideshow that discusses words, and then there's just a brief activity for you today, and that'll be it.